Hello chess lovers and welcome to Chess Insight. In this video, we're going to learn how to defend and counterattack against one of the most common beginner tricks in chess, the early queen attack. The game starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, and immediately white plays an aggressive move, queen to h5. When we're just starting out in chess, this setup often appears in our games. It's known as the scholar's mate. The main idea is simple. Target the pawn on e5, develop the bishop to c4, and try to deliver a quick checkmate on f7 with the queen. Even though this opening looks basic, many beginners still struggle to defend properly against this early queen attack. Most of them make the common mistake of pushing pawn to g6 to chase away the queen. But that's a fatal blunder, because white can simply capture the pawn on e5 with check, and even threaten the rook on the next move. That's why the correct move is to defend the pawn with knight to c6. White will often continue with bishop to c4, once again eyeing the weak f7 square. As we mentioned earlier, the idea behind this opening is to checkmate quickly with queen takes pawn on f7. So what should black do? We respond calmly with pawn to g6, blocking the threat and attacking the queen at the same time. Now you might be wondering, why not prevent checkmate by moving the queen to e7 or f6 instead? While those moves are playable, they come with drawbacks. Placing the queen on e7 blocks the dark squared bishop, and queen to f6 occupies the knight's natural developing square. That's why pawn to g6 remains the most natural and flexible choice. Since the pawn is attacking, white will usually retreat the queen to f3, still eyeing the same mating threat on f7. We can now respond with a simple move, knight to f6. This defends the f7 pawn and prepares a future jump to d4, where the knight could attack the queen and even create a fork against the king and rook on c2. Even though this opening is often associated with beginners, it has surprisingly appeared in professional games. Players like Alireza Firouzja, Hikaru Nakamura, and even Magnus Carlsen have experimented with the scholar's mate setup in official tournaments. At this stage, white has two correct defensive options, knight to e2 or pawn to c3. Both aim to control the d4 square and stop black's knight from jumping in. But before that, let's look at what happens if white gets too ambitious with pawn to g4. The idea behind g4 is to push g5 next, driving away the knight on f6. If the knight moves, white's queen could deliver a checkmate on f7. But here comes the trap. Black can immediately counter with knight to d4, attacking the queen and threatening a deadly fork on c2. If white tries to protect the pawn with queen to d3, then black simply captures on g4. The queen must fall back to d1 to keep guarding the pawn. In this position, don't rush to capture the central pawn on e4. Instead, strike with pawn to d5, attacking the bishop and adding pressure to the g4 pawn. After pawn captures pawn, we recapture with the bishop, again attacking the queen. Now white has three defensive choices, blocking with the knight, with the bishop, or with the pawn. Let's start with the first one. If white blocks with knight to e2, then black jumps in with knight to f3 check. The forced move is king to f1 and then bishop to h3, checkmate. If instead white blocks with bishop to e2, black simply captures it. After the knight recaptures, we play a powerful move. Queen takes pawn, attacking the rook. White's best defense is to castle short. Then black continues with knight to f3 check. After king moves to h1, we capture on d2, a discovered check. Pawn blocks, knight takes rook, and queen captures the knight. Trading a knight for a rook gives black a clear advantage. The third option is pawn to f3. Here, black can launch a brilliant sacrifice. Knight takes on e4. If the pawn captures the knight, the white queen will fall to the bishop. If instead the pawn captures the bishop, black plays queen to h4 check. The forced reply is king to f1, and then queen to f2, checkmate. Let's go back a few moves. So it's very important for white to control the d4 square and stop the knight jump. Let's start with the first proper move, knight to e2. This move also clears the way for the king to castle short. Black replies with bishop to g7, fianchettoing the bishop. Usually, white continues with pawn to d3, reinforcing the center and opening the diagonal for his dark squared bishop. In this position, we don't need to fear the pin from bishop to g5. We simply castle short, ensuring the king's safety. If white plays bishop to g5 to pin the knight, we chase it away with pawn to h6. If the bishop retreats to h4, we push pawn to g5, and after bishop to g3, we strike in the center with pawn to d4. After pawn takes pawn, bishop to g4 attacks the queen. The queen has only one safe square, e3. Then we can play knight to d4, piling up pressure on the knight and threatening a fork on c2. White must capture, and we recapture with the pawn. At first glance, it seems like we've just given up a pawn for nothing, but there's a hidden idea. After queen takes pawn, we move rook to e8, check. If the king runs to d2, knight to e4 follows, forking the king and queen, and the queen is lost on the next move. If the king instead steps to f1, black plays bishop to e2, check. After king to g1, knight to d7 opens the attack from the bishop against the white queen. There are no safe squares left for the queen, so she's doomed on the next move. But what if white tries to block the check with bishop to e5? Then we use a deflection tactic with pawn to c5. If the queen takes the pawn, the bishop on e5 falls. So the queen retreats to e3, still defending the bishop. Now black captures the central pawn with the knight, attacking the queen again. After bishop captures knight, we don't take back. Instead, we capture the dark squared bishop with our bishop. Now black threatens an X-ray attack on the white king and queen. If white tries to move the queen away, things get worse. For example, if bishop moves to e4, black plays bishop to f4, once again attacking the queen. White has no escape squares and must take the pawn on c5. Then comes the shocker. Rook takes bishop sacrifice. If the sacrifice is accepted, queen to d1 is checkmate. So white refuses the capture and moves the king to f1. It looks like black has no more attacks and the rook is hanging. But here comes another sacrifice. Rook to e1 check. After king takes rook, queen to e8 check follows. If the king steps back to f1, it's checkmate in 2 moves. If white blocks with the queen, bishop captures, and black is completely winning. Now let's return to the other main option, pawn to c3, preventing the knight from jumping to d4. As before, black continues with bishop to g7. White plays pawn to d3, supporting the center and preparing development. Instead of castling immediately, black plays knight to a5, attacking the bishop. After the bishop retreats to b3, we exchange knight for bishop. Pawn recaptures, and then we castle short. White's common idea is bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Don't panic, push pawn to h6. If the bishop stays on h4, push pawn to g5 again. After bishop to g3, we counter in the center with pawn to d5. It may look risky because the e5 pawn seems undefended. But if the bishop captures it, black strikes back with pawn takes pawn, attacking the queen. After pawn takes pawn, bishop to g4 attacks again. If the queen retreats to e3, queen to d1 would be checkmate. But what if white captures the knight with the bishop instead, and attacking the black queen, we respond with queen to d2. This not only saves our dark squared bishop, but also defends it. If the queen moves away, queen to d1 would be checkmate. So white is forced to capture our bishop, and after queen takes queen, black remains up in material. At this point, white's dark squared bishop is hanging, and there's also a threat of queen takes on g2, picking up the rook on h1. With a clear material advantage, black should have no trouble converting the win. Alright, chess lovers, that's how you defend and counterattack against the early queen attack. What opening should we break down next? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you again in the next chess analysis video.